Good afternoon. My name is Carter Woolley. I'm a manager of donor relations at the Institute for Humane Studies, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our crucial conversation today. I would like to thank all of our supporters who have joined. Because of you, a freer society is possible. Your investment in IHS is critical to ensuring that ideas rooted in the classical liberal tradition, such as the belief in the inherent dignity of every individual, the freedom of thought and expression, and the power of markets, reach beyond the walls of the university. At the Institute for Humane Studies, we believe that these principles are essential to ensuring human flourishing. And towards this end, IHS is investing in talented students, scholars, and other intellectuals who are advancing the principles and practice of freedom. Central to these practices is the belief that diverse viewpoints and the exchange of ideas are crucial to building a good society. We believe that fresh thinking and civil discourse are needed now more than ever. They matter in universities, in public policy, online, and to each person on this call today. And that's why we started Crucial Conversations, to bring you the best and brightest minds in their fields, applying their knowledge and research to solve today's most pressing problems. And if you enjoyed this crucial conversation as much as I think you will, then please be sure to register for our next one on Monday, August 19th at noon Eastern Time for a conversation on the future of AI with Colorado Boulder business professor Eric Alston. Today, however, our speaker is Nadine Strossen. Nadine will be speaking with IHS's Jason Cannon about the threats and opportunities that free speech faces. Nadine is one of this country's greatest free speech advocates and a shining star in our network. And now I would like to welcome on screen Jason and Nadine.
Thanks, Carter. Hi, everyone. I'm Jason Cannon, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to today's conversation with Nadine Strossen. Professor Strossen is one of the country's leading thinkers on free speech, and I can't think of a better guide to today's issues surrounding free expression and academic freedom, and that's what we're going to be discussing today. Nadine and I will talk for a little less than half an hour, after which we'll be sharing some of your questions with her. So I'd encourage you to drop those questions into the Zoom Q&A window, and there's a little Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. As Nadine and I are speaking, feel free to put your questions there, and we'll get to as many of those as we can at the end as we have time. And we really do want for this to be a conversation. I know that we've got many IHS supporters in the audience today. A special thanks to those who are attending. And those supporters will know that one of the things that makes IHS unique is the way that we create conversations among leading academics on the most important challenges of our time. And that's exactly what we're doing today with our conversation with Nadine Strossen, who is Professor Emerita at New York Law School and a senior fellow with our friends over at FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. She was also the national president of the ACLU from 1991 to 2008, an incredible tenure. And she's an internationally recognized expert, and she's widely known for her free speech advocacy around the world, her media commentary, and her service on the advisory boards of several organizations that promote free speech and academic freedom. Nadine, we're so grateful for you being with us here today. Thank you and welcome.
Oh, thank you so much, Jason. And also thanks to Carter for your very kind words. And let me say that as a longtime colleague with you and others at IHS, I am so grateful to IHS and to the donors and supporters who are participating in today's conversation for your absolutely important contributions to the traditional classical liberal values that we all share, but that are increasingly embattled from across the ideological spectrum. So I'm really honored to be in conversation with all of you.
Well, thank you. The honor is ours. So your most recent book, which was published last year, is called Free Speech, What Everyone Needs to Know. So why don't we just start there? What should everyone know about free speech?
I think the most important point for people to understand, Jason, in light of the exaggerated attacks on free speech that come from everybody, because basically the mantra for most people is freedom of speech for me, but not for thee. And that reflects a tremendous amount of misunderstanding about what the basic principles of free speech are. Those who attack strong speech protection under American law regularly attack a caricatured, distorted version of it, making claims such as, oh, it's ridiculously absolute and it's completely exceptional. It's different from every other country's law and international law. And you free speech defenders don't even acknowledge that speech can do any harm. No, no, no. I assure you that the more you know about our free speech principles, the more they accord with just plain common sense. They do empower government appropriately to restrict the speech that is the most dangerous because it poses an emergency. It imminently threatens or directly causes certain specific harm. Then it can and should be punished, consistent with First Amendment principles. However, First Amendment principles also bar government from engaging in the most dangerous censorship. That is censorship that violates what the Supreme Court has called the bedrock principle of free speech: viewpoint neutrality. Government must remain neutral with respect to the viewpoint, the idea, the perspective, the message of the speech. If it's odious to members of the public, they should respond, refute it, debate it, ignore it, whatever strategy is most effective. But it is not for government in our democratic republic which respects individual liberty. It's not for government to deprive us individuals of the freedom to choose what to listen to, what not to listen to. So those two core principles really knit together this very large, complex body of First Amendment law. Number one, government may never suppress speech solely because of disfavor of its viewpoint. But number two, if the speech poses an emergency, it can and should be restricted. I think that if most people understood that that's what the law is, they would say, oh, we support it enthusiastically.
Well, there's a lot there that I want to come back to in just a moment. But I'm curious, you've had this really illustrious career and have been dealing with these issues for so long. How did you get started in championing free speech? What were the precipitating moments that sort of brought you to study and advocate in this area?
Arising to consciousness as a sentient human being. Seriously, I don't exaggerate, Jason. Long before I had any concept of the legal terminology or human rights principles, I had a basic understanding, which I am convinced, based on my extensive reading and history and psychology and social science, that there is a basic human drive toward self-expression. I recently read an excellent new book about free speech by Jonathan Turley, professor at George Washington University, and he explains that the human brain is hardwired for freedom of expression. Another FIRE colleague of mine, Jakob Bichongama, in 2018 wrote a wonderful book about free speech called Freedom of Speech, A Global History from Socrates to Social Media. And he's shown that in every era of history, under every form of government, every type of society throughout the world, there have been people who have not only sought to exercise their free speech rights and defend it for others, but they have done so at great personal cost, as certainly Socrates illustrates. So I put myself, among the vast majority of humanity in wanting to raise my voice from the earliest age. To be very specific, because I know you were asking me, not about myself, not about history. I remember being very upset by teachers early in my educational career who told me that I was not allowed to ask certain questions, that certain questions would not be answered or indeed shouldn't even be posed at all. And actually, I was punished quite a few times as a young student for raising questions about curricular subjects and about the teacher's methodology. I also must admit I objected a bit to my parents' restrictions on my free speech rights. And more seriously, another example of censorship I faced fairly early on was in my public library in the town where I grew up, Hopkins, Minnesota, very severely restricted the access that young people under 18 had to books in the library. That was very frustrating to me as what at the time was called a bookworm. So, I had a series, and I defended a teacher when I was in middle school. A teacher was subject to censorial pressures from the local newspaper for exposing students to think about, not necessarily expressing critical views himself, but asking us to think about the Vietnam War, which was then very, very popular. It was very unpopular to even raise questions. So I had a series of events where I felt my free speech rights were thwarted. And I was thrilled when I learned that there are ways to push back against it, that there are legal rights and organizations that advocate those legal rights. That said, maybe the conclusion is that we should welcome censorship imposed against young people, so we would turn them into free speech champions. And I say that only half smilingly, Jason, because my experience in working with human rights activists and free speech champions in countries that more recently and more dramatically have experienced censorship are ferociously supportive of free speech in a way that I think too many Americans probably take it for granted and are therefore more able to dismiss it.
Well, let's dig into that educational context a little bit more, because I know that one thing that will be on the minds of everybody who's joining us today is the climate on campus these days for free expression. So you have been deeply engaged in these issues, not just over the past year, but for your entire career. So help us understand what's happening on campus right now and what can we collectively do about it?
Every survey, of which there have been many, of the free speech climate on campuses around the country in the recent past has been very dismal. In particular, not only are there too many incidents of university officials under pressure from various sources, ranging from state legislatures to student activists, the so-called leadership of the university actually too often fails to show leadership in standing up for free speech principles to which they pay lip service. And so we've seen instances of retaliation against people who express unpopular viewpoints on campus. We've seen deplatformings of speakers who are voicing unpopular views. But even beyond those official acts of university suppression, Jason, the single greatest threat to free speech on campus is the pervasive climate of self-censorship. Students and faculty members who are not afraid that they are going to be punished by the university administration, students who are not afraid that they are going to be punished by faculty members, but students and faculty members who are afraid that they are going to be shamed, shunned, ostracized, in other words, subject to cancel culture pressure by their peers. And let me cite just one of many, many studies that consistently document this problem. It's the most recent in a series of annual surveys on the campus free speech or lack of free speech climate that has been undertaken by FIRE and College Pulse. The most recent one was published last fall. It was the most detailed by far. It ranked 248 colleges and universities. And although there was a lot of difference, not surprisingly, between school ranked #1 and the school ranked number 248, which I think many people now realize that was my alma mater, Harvard, that came out in the congressional hearings last December. Harvard was at the bottom. Despite all the differences in terms of policies, in terms of administrative actions, official regulations, and so forth, to me, the single most chilling conclusion in a report that was filled with many chilling conclusions was the following, and I've actually committed the sentence to memory. Between school #1 and school number 248, the entire universe of the survey, on one crucially important vector, do you feel comfortable voicing your opinion on campus? The difference between #1 and number 248 was negligible. In other words, no matter how positive the administration's policies and practices and regulations are, students are still going to engage in massive self-censorship. And by the way, the self-censorship was about the most important topics that are at the center of public policy debates, including abortion and police practices and immigration and anything to do with race or gender. And so in highlighting what the single greatest problem is, that turns to the second part of your question: what can we do about it? Given that the problem, such a core problem, is peer pressure that is coming from within the culture among the students on our campuses, there is only a limited amount that those of us who are not directly part of that culture, who are not directly peers, can do. But we certainly can be role models and mentors. We certainly can do everything we can. And here I want to salute IHS for doing this, along with FIRE and Heterodox Academy and a cluster of wonderful organizations in this area, of identifying and supporting and educating and training those students who are organically emerging on campus as having the courage and the principles and the leadership qualities to push for a counterculture of free speech. And, you know, this has happened on so many campuses. It's one of the reasons I love traveling the campus circuit, is I get to meet amazingly impressive, courageous young people. I think what's very telling and should be encouraging to all of us, Jason, is surveys also show that these students who are advocating openness to differing perspectives, advocating respectful listening and toleration of dissenting views and open discourse and dialogue, they actually represent the majority sentiment on campus, as public opinion polls show about the public in general. It's just, and I put that in quotes because it's a serious problem, that the majority of people who hunger for dialogue and dissent and so forth don't speak out as much as the outspoken activists and speech suppressors at either extreme. So it's wonderful, though, that students are emerging to do that. And again, I thank IHS for the support it has given. And let me quote, when I speak to the student activists, you know, I ask them, what makes you tick? How can we replicate what you're doing among other students? And one of the points that they make is that those of us older folks, non-students, and our organizations have to do a better job at marketing. They've told me that quite constructively, critically, that if they had known that there was such a wealth of support from organizations such as IHS, that would have made it even easier for them to speak out in the way that they did.
Mm. Well, you're right. These issues are really close to our hearts. And in fact, we just launched a new fund recently to support the scholars and the faculty who are creating the conditions on campus for these students to be able to come together and have those really frank and open discussions. And our experience aligns exactly with what you've said, which is that students are craving that sort of an environment. And the faculty who are creating those events have a lot more that they want to be able to do than they have the resources to do, which is one of the interventions that we're trying to make. And it does seem like there really is a hunger for the sorts of environments on campus where students can freely express ideas, exchange ideas, change their mind. And it's so essential that we create those conditions. And that leads me to another question. I know that you have given a lot of thought and written and spoken quite a bit about institutional neutrality, which seems like another intervention that needs to be made here. Can you tell us a little bit about what institutional neutrality means in practice and how it can help with this problem?
Yes, a very, very important policy that until recently was not very well known, but thanks to, again, in scare quotes, thanks to the problems that have developed, especially dramatically after October 7th, with encampments and disruptive protests and claims of suppression of every kind of viewpoint on Middle Eastern politics, and the embarrassment that university presidents faced in making statements that were criticized, no matter what they said, probably criticized from more than one perspective. I think they realized the virtues of institutional neutrality, which means this, Jason, as you well know, that the university itself and its top leadership must remain neutral with respect to general public policy issues, no matter how important the issues are, unless they are issues that directly, specifically affect the university's mission itself. So unfortunately, we have seen some policies that do that. Some state legislatures or governors have been considering or threatening measures that would undermine academic freedom, for example, by doing away with tenure, by imposing constrictions on the curriculum. That kind of policy that directly threatens the truth-seeking mission of the university, its signature mission in our society, the university has a responsibility to speak out about. But if we're talking about war in the Middle East or racial policies at home or Supreme Court decisions about abortion, to cite one of countless examples on which university presidents have felt pressured to issue statements recently, they should remain silent, not out at all out of indifference or insensitivity to the importance of the issues, but for precisely the opposite reason. Because these issues are so important, it is essential for the university leadership to do everything it can to foster the most robust debate and exchange of viewpoints on those issues among the individual members of the university community, the faculty and the students. And if the university president is issuing a statement, or the chair of a department or the dean of a school, that has a chilling effect on the free speech and academic freedom rights of those who actually hold and should exercise those rights. Imagine that you're an untenured faculty member and the chair of your department issues what is the approved departmental view on a controversial public policy issue. Are you going to feel comfortable voicing a different opinion? At best, you'll probably be silent. At worst, you may be feel a pressure to pay lip service to views that are antithetical to your own. And as is always the case with free speech and academic freedom on campus, Jason, it is important not only to the members of the campus community, but as the Supreme Court has recognized, for our society at large. We depend on that kind of robust debate on our campuses as the most effective mechanism for pursuing truth, which benefits all of society.
So we have just a few more minutes for our part of this conversation, Nadine. And I'll just remind the audience, by the way, that if you have questions for Nadine, go ahead and drop them into the Q&A box in your Zoom window. And so my last question for you will take us into some more contemporary questions that have been in the news lately. And I think one of the things that strikes me as being so unique, troubling about our current moment, but also creates some opportunity, is that issues about free speech are on the front page on a daily basis these days. So it's hard to think of a freedom that is more pressing in terms of people's actual experience of it. And one of those cases that's been on the front page lately has been the recent Supreme Court decisions on content moderation online. So think about Twitter and Facebook and many of the other social media platforms that we use. So can you unpack what the Supreme Court said, what the cases we're dealing with, and kind of how we can think about content moderation in a better way?
The Supreme Court left a number of decisions unresolved because of technical legal issues that I won't bore the audience with. But nonetheless, what the Supreme Court did say was very significant. Although I have to say it's consistent with the court's earlier rulings about online speech, going back to the historic case, I can't help name dropping here, of Reno versus ACLU back in 1997 was the Supreme Court's landmark decision in which it rejected arguments that were then very popular all across the political spectrum. And I think it's important for younger members of the audience to have this historical context, Jason. The internet was greeted with the same fear and even panic that all new communications media have been throughout history. And the first response of Congress, with support from across the political spectrum, was to censor it because of its feared danger, especially to young people. And it was wonderful that the Supreme Court rejected what Congress had done 9-0 and said, no, the internet receives the same free speech protection that traditional media have, such as newspapers. And it did essentially the same thing in the most recent decision that you alluded to about the so-called content moderation policies of social media companies. The Supreme Court again said those are entitled to the same high free speech protection under the First Amendment that traditional media receive with respect to their editorial discretion. The cases involved laws by two states, Texas and Florida, that sought to impose restrictions on the content moderation policies that were being followed by social media companies. And the Supreme Court said that governments may no more tell these platforms what speech they must exclude, what speech they must not exclude, than it would be able to do that to the New York Times or Fox News or any other media platform. So that was a very, very significant holding. Now, the other major set of holdings that the Supreme Court reached were in another pair of cases that involved another threat to free speech on social media. And that is when the social media companies suppressed, either through directly, completely deplatforming or through downgrading or labeling, otherwise making less visible certain controversial messages and certain controversial speakers, the allegation being that they were not simply enforcing their own voluntarily adopted content moderation policies, but rather they were doing so under significant pressure from government officials. The particular case involved various government officials and agencies in the Biden administration, but I want to point out that those same practices had been initiated under the Trump administration, and we can anticipate that any administration, no matter which political party, would of course be facing enormous temptation to continue to pressure the social media companies, maybe to, with very different policy orientations, but raising the same First Amendment danger, which is that the government should not be allowed to do indirectly by proxy what it would not be allowed to do directly by outright censorship. That said, the so-called disinformation about the alleged disinformation about COVID in particular, that was the target of suppression in these cases, nobody disagreed was completely constitutionally protected. The government itself would have had no power under the First Amendment to directly suppress any of that expression. So the government should not be allowed to do through the back door what it clearly can't do through the front door. In a nutshell, the Supreme Court said that the factual record was not sufficiently developed to show that the particular suppression that was complained of was in fact due to government pressure. So that's a factual dispute, and future cases can be raised that if they document that the reason for the suppression was in fact undue pressure from the government, the Supreme Court did acknowledge that would violate the First Amendment.
All right, well, let's move to the audience Q&A portion. And the first question also continues this thread of recent events. So this question asks about another real world case that's been in the news lately, which is Scotland's new hate speech ban. So you wrote, Nadine, an entire book on hate speech. Why do these bans keep coming up, and what should we do about them?
These bans keep coming up for the same reason that any controversial, unpopular expression is constantly targeted for censorship. And when you think about it, Jason, I'm very sympathetic, right? If somebody is saying something vile, why should we protect the right to say it? Well, because if we really care about reducing the vile opinion, the hateful idea, if we really care about restricting actual hateful, discriminatory conduct, then by all means, we should take steps. And I do strongly encourage educational efforts to change people's minds, free speech exercises to refute hateful ideology, law enforcement efforts to punish actual violent, discriminatory conduct that reflects hateful attitudes. But suppressing speech solely because it conveys an hateful and hated viewpoint not only violates that cardinal bedrock viewpoint neutrality principle I talked about, but is at best ineffective and at worst counterproductive. What I found in doing the research for the book that you kindly referenced, Jason, is that human rights activists all around the world, including in Scotland, have taken a very dim view of hate speech laws, not at all because of the free speech guarantees in their own countries. No, those laws are consistent with the lesser free speech protections in most other countries' constitutions, but solely from the perspective of what is an effective strategy for countering the hateful attitudes. The historical record shows that these laws do more harm than good. Why more harm than good? Well, they create martyrs. People who would otherwise be very unsympathetic can present themselves as free speech martyrs. They attract sympathy and attention that the ideas otherwise never would have. And the patterns of history show this over and over and over again. These laws are disproportionately enforced to silence the very minority views and speakers that are intended to be protected by the laws. So, even in the United States, where the fact that hate speech is constitutionally protected doesn't stop politicians and others from constantly calling for it to be suppressed. And in that vein, we've had government officials say that Black Lives Matter advocacy is hate speech. It's hate speech against white people. It's hate speech against police officers, and therefore it should be suppressed. But let me also say that the phrase white lives matter has been attacked as hate speech in this country. The phrase free speech has been attacked as hate speech in this country, including on college campuses. What I'm underscoring is that the concept is inherently subjective. And when we empower any government official to make such subjective discretionary decisions, we can predict that they're going to be made in a way that does not favor any dissenting or minority voice.
Well, that dovetails nicely with this next question, which is about free speech absolutism, which you mentioned in your first response. There is a sense in some quarters that folks who advocate for free speech just don't want to give any sort of room for restricting actually dangerous free speech. And you mentioned a few examples in your first comment. I think the audience will be familiar about the scenario of shouting fire in a crowded theater. And it seems like with the vision of free speech that you have sketched is a much more nuanced and subtle version of how to think about these rights and protections than they often get caricatured. So, so could you just unpack how that nuance sort of works in a practical legal way? Whether the charge of absolutism, quote unquote, is accurate or fair?
Okay, but I first want to show, I took a drink and I want folks to see my favorite mug here with the First Amendment text on it from the Unemployed Philosophers Guild. So, Jason, as I mentioned, the Supreme Court has recognized that the First Amendment does not protect speech that poses an emergency, where you can show that the speech either directly causes certain specific harm or where it imminently threatens certain serious harm. The Supreme Court has recognized several subcategories of speech that satisfy this standard, which is very fact specific. It has to be because it is based not just on the content of the speech, right? The message that would violate the viewpoint neutrality principle. But no matter what the message, if in a particular context, it causes an emergency, then it can and should be punished. So let me mention a few of the subcategories, many of which will sound familiar. One is intentional incitement of imminent violent or lawless conduct that is likely to actually happen imminently. Another is a true threat, where the speaker targets particular audience member and means to instill a reasonable fear, which means an objective fear, not a subjective fear on the part of an unusually thin-skinned person, that they will be subject to imminent attack. One that has been quite relevant, sadly, on campuses in light of recent events is intimidation, threats that cause a hostile environment. And here the legal definition is if conduct, including expressive conduct, is, and you have to again consider all of the facts and circumstances campus-wide, if they are sufficiently severe and pervasive and objectively offensive so as to deprive a particular student or group of students of an equal educational opportunity, that constitutes discriminatory hostile environment harassment in violation of Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And as many audience members will know, the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education has initiated a number of investigations and complaints against a number of campuses, including Ivy League campuses, for violating their obligation to enforce Title VI and prevent that kind of discriminatory, hostile environment harassment. All of that said, Jason, let me explain a common sense reason why those of us who strongly protect free speech are the ones who, I would say, at least as much, if not more than other people, recognize that speech has limited scopes when it does pose an emergency, because in all of those situations, the speaker who is engaging in threatening, harassing, hostile environment, inciting expression is interfering with other people's free speech rights. If you reasonably fear that you're going to be subject to an attack because of what the person who is threatening you says, not only is that going to interfere with your freedom of movement and your privacy, it's going to deter you from exercising your free speech rights. So one thing that I have to say, I'm constantly trying to learn and improve, refine my understanding of freedom of speech. And one of the sad lessons that has really been drilled home to me after October 7th is, if we are to have robust, meaningful free speech climates on university campuses, not only is it essential that the universities not punish speech that is constitutionally protected, it is equally important that they do punish speech that is not constitutionally protected, because that's a prerequisite for other people exercising their free speech rights.
Well, I'm afraid we just have time for one more question. And that question goes back to something that you had spoken about a little bit earlier, related to what we can do to make things better related to free speech. So on campus, you had several good comments, but this question asks more broadly, what can we do to create both a culture and a set of legal and political institutions that foster a more robust environment for free thought and free expression?
When you say we, Jason, I'm going to take it that you mean each of us as individuals, because I know that the people who are supporting IHS and who are participating in this webinar are so committed. So, of course, keep supporting wonderful organizations such as IHS that are doing this work, but each and every one of us in our own lives can do an amazing amount. Number one is to be knowledgeable about what free speech is, to be available to correct misimpressions and misstatements that we will encounter every day in everyday conversation. So by knowing what the principles are and conveying them to other people, serving that educational function, I have come to understand, Jason, that I've always separated my role as an educator from my role as an advocate, but they really overlap. The more people understand about what free speech principles are, the more supportive they are of them. So everybody can evangelize in your own family, in your own community groups. And all of us have to learn to practice what we preach in every possible interaction. That is to listen respectfully. I would say to seek out views that are different from ours, and not just as opportunities to dictate what our own views are, but to listen with curiosity and with empathy, to try to understand the reasons why people have different perspectives, including different perspectives about free speech, and as a way to help to open their minds to different perspectives. And you do that certainly not by punishing, certainly not by shaming, shunning, and ostracizing, but through sympathetic dialogue, including reaching points of agreement. And I think my experience is that the deeper you dig, you will find, at some level, you will find some agreement. Most people agree on the bottom line goals. They may disagree about the methods for getting there. And I have dealt with so many people who really were committed to censoring hate speech or disinformation. And I gave them a couple examples, building on on situations that I knew would be particularly bothersome to them. So that's why I use the Black Lives Matter example. With many liberals and others who support the Black Lives Matter movement are shocked to learn that that could be considered to be hate speech. So all of us can and I hope will do a lot to improve the free speech climate by exercising our own free speech rights and respecting those of everybody with whom we interact.
Well, that was wonderfully put. Thank you, Nadine. That's all the time that we have for today's conversation. But on behalf of everyone at IHS and in the audience, let me just say that we're so grateful that you took the time today to share these views with us and help us have a better context for where these issues sit in today's political climate. So
my great pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity, Jason.
So for everyone joining us today, thanks for being here. IHS hosts this conversation and conversations like these because we're engaged in precisely the project that Nadine has mentioned, which is bringing attention back to the human and to the humane and doing the hard work of renewing Enlightenment values for our time, one of the foremost of which is free expression and open debate. And we're only able to do that work because of the support of folks like you who we have in the audience today. So once again, I just want to say thank you for making all of this possible. As Carter mentioned at the beginning of the call, today's part of an ongoing series of virtual conversations, just like this one. And we're excited to invite you to our next conversation, which will happen next month in August, where we will be talking with Professor Eric Alston about all sorts of issues related to artificial intelligence. I know that conversation is one that you won't want to miss. And so again, from me and from everyone at IHS, thanks for joining us today. Thanks for everything that all of you do for advancing a free and open society. We'll hope to see you soon.